Jake returned home from his business trip late in the evening, exhausted but relieved to be back. His wife, Jessica, who he had started calling Jess ever since they first met in college, was there to greet him with a soft smile. She looked different to him now, maybe a bit more vibrant, a bit more eager, and tonight, a bit more something. But Jake brushed it off, telling himself it was just his tired eyes playing tricks after too many hours in airport terminals. "Jake, honey, I have some news," Jess said, her grin shy yet sparkling. But there was something in her eyes that Jake couldn't quite place, something that didn't match her smile. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. Jake paused. The words hung in the air, feeling like they echoed, heavier than he was ready to face. But he quickly composed himself, giving her a reassuring nod and pulling her into a gentle hug. He told himself to act happy, even though the news felt like a strange weight in his chest. "That's wonderful, Jess," he murmured softly. She took a deep breath and held his hand a little tighter. "We're going to have twins," she said. The word twins seemed to press harder on Jake's already heavy heart. He forced a smile and nodded as Jess excitedly talked about doctors' due dates and things that felt so unfamiliar to him. He was supposed to feel joy, he knew that, but instead, all he could manage was hollow acceptance, a weak attempt to mirror Jess's enthusiasm. Before long, she switched to another topic. "Oh, and we'll have to do one of those big gender reveal parties. Maybe with fun contests and games. Doesn't that sound fun?" She practically bounced with excitement. "Sure," Jake replied, trying to hide his weariness. "Whatever you want, Jess." Their young son, Alex, perked up when he overheard the word party. "A party?" he asked, his little face lighting up at the idea of games and festivities. Jake smiled at Alex, ruffling his hair. But even as he smiled, a nagging feeling gnawed at him. He watched his son, seeing him through a different lens now. He spent a bit of time with Alex, listening to him chatter on about the party ideas Jess had mentioned. But his mind was elsewhere, lost in a muddle of suspicion and dread. He tried to push it down, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. Jess's news had only confirmed something Jake had feared for a long time. He knew too much. He had started to uncover Jess's secrets months ago, secrets that had shaken the foundation of their family. Now, as the news of twins hung in the air, Jake realized he couldn't ignore the truth. Their family was at a crossroads, and he felt as if he were standing alone, watching the road ahead split. A few days later, Jake found himself heading back to the airport, preparing for yet another business trip. His life had been set to the rhythm of these trips, long flights, stale hotel rooms, and the sight of unfamiliar cities under hazy morning skies. For years, he hadn't worried about what was happening back home. He trusted Jess completely, always believing their marriage was built on honesty and love. But now, as he settled into his seat on the plane, a weight pressed heavily on his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't known before, one that had crept up on him slowly in recent months, a quiet, bitter unease. Jake had never been the kind of man to question Jess's loyalty. He loved her, and she was the mother of his son. But now, little things that he had pushed aside kept creeping back, pulling at him with nagging persistence. He opened his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keys before opening a folder that wasn't filled with project files or spreadsheets. It was something he'd kept hidden, locked away, even from himself. It was like a bad dream he didn't want to remember. As he scrolled through the folder, he felt none of the satisfaction he had expected. Instead, a hollow, sickening sadness swept over him. The videos only added to his unease, filling him with anger that he had tried to bottle up, pretending it wasn't there. Jake closed his eyes for a moment and leaned back, trying to shake the sense of betrayal that seemed to settle deeper into his bones. His mind wandered, and suddenly, an image of Brian, his neighbor, floated into view. Brian with his easygoing smile, the way he had come over last summer to help Jake clear the yard without hesitation. Brian, always quick with a joke, a pat on the back, and a warm laugh. Could someone really be that good, that warm, that open, without hiding something beneath the surface? The thought left a sour taste in Jake's mouth, and he couldn't shake it. People can be chameleons, he told himself. People can put on masks, especially those you trust the most. That realization made him uneasy, and it all circled back to one thing. One unavoidable truth that Jake couldn't ignore. Even as the plane soared high above a world he suddenly felt disconnected from. He knew what was coming next. He had to be ready for the party Jess had planned. The grand gender reveal event she was so excited about. She'd told him it would be in a few months, and it would be like no other, something their friends and family would remember for years. But Jake knew that for him, this party wouldn't be about balloons and confetti. He would be preparing for something else entirely. Jake wanted to end it all, to tear down the shaky facade that he and Jess were living behind. He felt caged in, but he couldn't act on it, not yet. Jake knew he needed time to get his affairs in order. There was too much at stake, and if he acted impulsively, he'd risk losing more than just his peace of mind. For the first time, he questioned everything he'd once taken for granted about his family, even about his little boy, Alex. Alex was only 6, innocent and pure-hearted, and Jake's greatest fear was having him caught in the middle of a storm he never asked for. So, Jake bided his time. He held on to his suspicions, quietly building a path toward freedom, a way to walk away from the life he once loved, with his head held high and his assets intact. The weeks crawled by, each one a strange mix of resentment, patience, and small preparations. Jessica, absorbed in the excitement of her pregnancy, planned every detail of the twins' arrival with an enthusiasm that would have been contagious in another world. She chatted about cribs, baby clothes, and the big gender reveal party she was so excited about. She never noticed a change in Jake. She didn't see how his once open gaze had turned calculating, how he had started staying up late at night, not working, but preparing for the life he was soon going to live on his own terms. Jake played the role of the devoted husband, keeping up appearances while he secretly prepared for the life that would soon be his. He met with his lawyer in secret, made careful adjustments to his finances, and arranged a modest, quiet living situation away from all the pretense. He even looked into matters concerning Alex, an area that kept him awake with worry. As the months passed, Jake became a master of patience. He smiled on cue, laughed at the right moments, but always with a growing sense of resolve. Finally, the day arrived, the day of the grand reveal. Their backyard was transformed with colorful tables, flower arrangements, and banners welcoming guests. Family and friends mingled, and Jessica, glowing with excitement, moved among them. The guests exchanged predictions about whether the twins would be boys or girls. Jake moved through the crowd quietly, his face serious, his thoughts a million miles away from the idle chatter around him. He wore his best suit, a sharp, well-tailored one he hadn't worn in years. His eyes scanned the crowd, and when they landed on Brian, his neighbor, laughing with someone near the refreshments, his gaze lingered. Brian noticed and flashed a friendly smile, but Jake chose not to return it. Today, Jake didn't need to pretend. He stood tall, scanning the scene before him like a hawk, feeling the weight of months of secrets and silent resolve pressing down on him. He was ready. The step he had been planning for was finally here. The step that would free him from the tangled mess his life had become. Jessica, practically glowing, took to the little platform they'd set up in the backyard. She smiled wide and began her speech, thanking everyone for coming to celebrate this special day with them. "Family means everything to us," she said, looking over the crowd. "And with our 2 little ones on the way, we're so excited to start this new chapter together. We thought a fun contest would make today even more special." The crowd clapped eagerly, everyone buzzing with anticipation for the grand reveal. A large balloon filled with confetti, either pink or blue, hovered in the center of the platform. Jessica turned to Jake, eyes sparkling with excitement, but he held up a hand to quiet the crowd. "Before we get to the big moment," Jake said, his voice steady, "I'd like to give my wife a small gift." Jessica looked surprised but smiled, probably thinking it was just another sweet gesture. Jake handed her a beautifully wrapped box with a neat ribbon, the bright wrapping paper almost cheerful in contrast to the cold determination in his eyes. The crowd fell silent, curious. Jessica opened the box slowly. As she peeled back the paper and lifted the lid, her smile faded. Inside were 2 stacks of papers. The first stack was thick, legal-looking, and stamped with the unmistakable words, "Divorce Papers." The second stack, thinner but no less devastating, had DNA test results printed boldly at the top, with Jake and Alex's names beneath. The color drained from Jessica's face as she pulled the papers out, struggling to comprehend what she was holding. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and everyone froze, waiting for an explanation. Jake turned to face them, his voice loud and clear, cutting through the silence. "I shouldn't be the one standing here," he said. "These future twins, this big reveal. It's not for me. It's for Brian." He pointed to the neighbor standing awkwardly at the back of the crowd, drink still in hand. "Brian should be up here. He should be the one popping this balloon." Gasps echoed through the crowd as heads turned to Brian, who looked like he'd just been struck by lightning. His face was pale, eyes wide in disbelief. His wife, standing beside him, went rigid, gripping her glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jessica, still reeling, looked at Jake, tears welling up in her eyes. Her voice shook as she whispered, "Jake, these are divorce papers and DNA test results. What's going on? Why are you doing this?" Jake met her gaze with a hard determination that had been building for months. "Jessica," he replied, his voice low but clear, "I know more than you think. I know about the secret life you've been leading, about the lies you've been feeding me, all while I was working hard for our family. And as for how I found out, it's all right there, in black and white. I had to do what was right. Alex and I deserve the truth." The guests exchanged stunned looks, whispers growing louder as the pieces started to fall into place. The reality of the betrayal settled over the crowd like a dark cloud. A tense, almost surreal hush fell over the yard as everyone processed what had just happened. Jessica, still gripping the divorce papers and DNA results, looked as if her world had just shattered in her hands. She blinked, her lips parted, too stunned to form words. Jake stood tall, unsmiling, waiting until the silence became almost unbearable. With a quick, calm breath, Jake spoke again. "Well, Jess, why don't we get back to what you planned?" He nodded toward the black balloon dangling above them. "Everyone's waiting for the big reveal. After all." Jessica, wide-eyed and trembling, just stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, no words coming out. Jake stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice carrying a weary authority. "You know, it's funny how life works. While I was busy working hard, planning for a future with my wife and son, my faithful wife was out there finding, let's say, adventures in the embrace of another man." He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the shocked crowd. "I could show you all the footage from the cameras I installed at home," he continued, his tone unwavering. "But, dear guests, I'd rather spare you from those dirty videos. You don't need to see the details to understand what's been going on." Gasps rippled through the crowd, people exchanging glances, some murmuring in disbelief, others stunned into silence. Jessica's friends covered their mouths, their shock and confusion written plainly across their faces. Jessica herself was breathing heavily now, her face a mix of horror and humiliation. "But that's not even the worst part," Jake said, his voice colder now. He looked directly at Jessica, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "The worst part is that all of this led me to question things I never wanted to question. I did a DNA test with my son, Alex." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in with the audience. "Turns out, Alex isn't my child." Jessica shook her head frantically, her face red with anger and disbelief. "No, Jake, no. This is insane," she sputtered, her voice climbing to a near shriek. "What kind of sick joke is this? Alex is your son, and these babies, they're yours too." But her voice faltered, the conviction in her words drowned out by the guilt and pain etched on her face. Jake shook his head, unmoved. Don't know who Alex's father is, Jessica. Maybe it's Brian. But what I do know for certain is that Brian is the father of these twins." The crowd fell dead silent, the impact of Jake's words settling in. All eyes turned to Brian, who stood pale and stiff, his mouth hanging open in stunned horror. His wife, standing beside him, stared at him, her own shock and hurt mixing with fury. Jake gave a small wave to the crowd, gesturing as though this were any other party, any other ordinary goodbye. "For those of you who want more details, you're welcome to join me at divorce court," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But it's time for me to go. I'm moving on to a new life, one without the lies and betrayal." A ripple of whispers erupted among the guests as Jake took one last look around the yard. Jessica, unable to hold back any longer, burst into tears. Her voice rose into a frantic, panicked shout. "No! This is all a lie, Jake. You can't believe this. I am your wife. I am faithful. This is just a sick misunderstanding." She stumbled toward him, hands clutching the papers, pleading, "Jake, please." But Jake merely turned his back on her, moving toward the gate. Brian tried to intercept him, his face twisted with anger. "Jake, come on, we need to talk." "You can't just walk away," Brian hissed, reaching out to stop him. Jake didn't break stride. With a simple motion, he sidestepped and tripped Brian, sending him sprawling to the ground. Looking down at him, Jake's voice was low but firm. "You're not my neighbor, Brian. You're not my friend. You're the same kind of traitor as Jess, and I have nothing more to say to you." Without another word, Jake stepped over Brian and walked to his car. The guests parted as he moved through them. He got into the driver's seat, took one last look at the stunned faces surrounding him, and started the engine. With one final, steady glance back at his former life, he pulled out of the driveway, leaving the gasps, the whispers, and the shattered pieces of his past behind him. No one knew where he was going. All he knew was that he was driving toward a life that was finally his own. In the months that followed, Jake attended the divorce hearings with a steely calm. His preparation was evident in every step he took. He had been ready for this, ensuring that his assets were secure, well hidden, and untouchable. He had shielded his finances with a precision that only he understood, leaving no loophole for Jessica to exploit. Every account, every investment, and every piece of property had been transferred to an entity beyond Jessica's reach. Jake walked into the courthouse, knowing that he was miles ahead. No matter what Jessica or her lawyer tried, they wouldn't be able to touch what he'd worked so hard to protect. The evidence he presented stunned the courtroom. In addition to the divorce papers, Jake submitted hours of video footage from the hidden cameras he'd installed in his home. Clear as day, there was Jessica in various rooms of their house, her arms wrapped around Brian. The two of them were whispering, laughing, and slipping into places that should have been reserved for him. The footage, paired with Jake's account of his years on the road, working tirelessly for his family, was damning. The judge's face hardened as he watched the tapes, Jessica squirming uncomfortably at her table, unable to look anyone in the eye. When the twins were born, Jessica and Brian's last hopes for any semblance of a future were crushed. A DNA test confirmed what Jake already knew. Brian was the father, not only the twins, but also of Alex, the little boy Jake had raised as his own. The revelation was devastating, revealing a 6-year affair that had spanned nearly half of Jake and Jessica's marriage. The timeline was clear, and there was no denying that Jessica and Brian had been entangled in this deception for years. Brian found himself in a courtroom of his own. His wife, upon learning the truth, had promptly filed for divorce, armed with the evidence Jake had shared with her. Out of decency, she walked away with almost everything and a sizable alimony check. Brian, the man who once joked and laughed freely with Jake over the backyard fence, was now faced with 3 children and support payments he couldn't hope to manage. Jessica and Brian were left with nothing but each other and a heap of debt, alimony, and the daunting task of raising 3 children without the security or trust they'd once taken for granted. For Jake, the outcome was everything he'd hoped for. He emerged from the trial with his assets intact and his dignity restored. He knew he hadn't allowed himself to be fooled any longer than necessary. The people in the courtroom had seen through Jessica's defenses, through her attempts to paint herself as a misunderstood woman caught in a situation out of her control. The truth, stark and undeniable, had come to light, and Jessica was left to face the consequences with the partner she had chosen, whether knowingly or out of impulse, all those years ago. With the final judgment in his favor, Jake took a long, deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in years. The weight of suspicion, heartbreak, and betrayal had been lifted. He wasn't the husband who had been blindsided. He was the man who had faced it all, prepared himself, and come out the other side stronger. As he walked out of the courthouse on the last day, Jake's mind drifted to the future. He thought of a quiet beach, somewhere warm and bright, with an ocean stretching as far as he could see. That's where he would go next, he decided. Somewhere where the sound of the waves could drown out all the noise of the past year. He would let the sun and salt air mend his mind and heart, putting the pieces of himself back together. All he wanted now was peace. A fresh start and a chance to reclaim his life, free from the shadows of betrayal. And he was finally free to do just that.